Hey, Margie here. Oxalates is a topic that I get asked about all the time because there's so much confusing information, and many people aren't even aware that it can be negatively affecting our bone health. Well, today we're going to delve into this because it's something that we need to know about. And for some people, this talk can be life changing. So, our special guest today is Julie Matthews, and Julie is a certified nutrition consultant who has received her master's degree in medical nutrition. And she has a lot of experience working with oxalates and helping people with oxalates in their diets. And she's also a published nutrition researcher and specializes in complex neurological, digestive, and immune conditions. Her specialty is autism, and her approach is based on the bio-individual nutrition and needs of each person. She provides diet and nutrition guidance backed by scientific research and applied clinical experience. Her award-winning book, Nourishing Hope for Autism, has helped people around the world. She presents at leading conferences in the United States and abroad and is the co-founder of Nourishing Hope and BioIndividual Nutrition Institute. Julie has a private nutrition practice in San Francisco, California, and supports families and clinicians from around the world with her nutrition learning tools and professional training courses. And I'm really excited to have Julie here because this is a topic she deals with on a daily basis. And she's going to help us all figure out what oxalates are. Do we need to worry about them? What can we do? How can we lower the oxalates in our diet? And more. So lots of great information. Stay tuned. Welcome, Julie. I'm so happy to have you here on the podcast. This topic is something people either don't want to hear about at all, but should, or I've just been getting so many questions, and it's a topic that has so much interest because it's been ignored for so long, because it's not really that popular. And I just think it's super, super important, as everyone will hear as we get through the interview. But thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, you know what? I always like to hear the backstory. Now, here you are, a person working with autism, teaching practitioners, doing all these things. How did you get so involved with oxalates?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So for years, as you said, my specialty has been children with autism, and they have very significant gastrointestinal issues that go along with their neurological condition and immune system things going on and all of this. And so what's interesting about this population is that they have a lot of things in common with a lot of other chronic conditions because they have these broader systems being affected. And one of those systems has to do with, methylation and sulfation and all of that. So I started studying the underlying factors that involved them. And in the process, I started to have clients that would come in and say, this diet really helped me. And then someone else say, no, that diet wasn't good, but this diet really helped me. Or we'd work together and we'd discover this other diet really helped somebody. So I started to realize early on that there were a lot of different diets, and it depended on that specific person's biochemical individuality, what was unique about them as to what dietary approach they needed. And during that process, as often seems to happen in the world, I had a client with a situation involving oxalates, and Susan Owens, who was one of my mentors at the time, way back when she was doing sulfation and salicylates and all these kinds of things, or I was doing salicylates and using her sulfate and sulfation work to understand how to help them, she started transitioning into the world of oxalate because of this relationship between sulfate and oxalate, which we don't necessarily need to go into. But so I started following her oxalate information, and that's when some of the pieces came together with one of my clients who had gotten really great results from a low oxalate diet. So that's kind of what got me started. And then a few years later, she was involved with some Polish researchers into a pretty groundbreaking study on oxalates and autism, and found that there is this very interesting connection between high oxalate levels in the urine and plasma and individuals with autism. And so that further took me down the path. And now I work with a wide range of different chronic conditions because The parents would have autoimmune disorders or gastrointestinal disorders or other things. And I started to look at and see a lot of the similar underlying factors affect not only kids with autism, but a wide range of chronic health conditions. And so that's when I started to get much more into how can oxalates be used for autoimmune conditions, bone health, all these other things. And so now I teach people on how to use these therapeutic diets and bioindividual nutrition on a much broader level than just autism.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's go to the bones. And it's really important because many of the nutrients that people, really think are so great and high in calcium and all the almond milk and all these things that people are thinking and eating and taking because they're good for calcium are also high in oxalates. So this is something that's so important for everybody to listen to. So
Yes.
why don't you share how the oxalates, why don't you just start actually what they are? Let's go to the very basic level. Like what are
Yeah.
oxalates and then how do they affect the bones?
Right. The oxalates are this ion or this, molecule that is, um, some people, it's called oxalic acid, but it's also called oxalate. And it's a substance that can cause a lot of inflammation and pain in the body. It can bind to calcium as well as other minerals, and it can get into the cell. It can damage mitochondria. It can cause a lot of inflammation, oxidative stress, pain. Uh, there are a lot of kind of factors that it's involved with, but that's, I think, the primary component. People often think of it associated with kidney stones because that oxalate can really negatively affect. The kidney stones are some of them are made of calcium oxalate or other types of oxalate, and that's one of the major challenges with the individuals that have that is it's very inflammatory, very painful, and it causes a lot of challenges.
So let's go through the bones now. What actually happens that it can, really affect our bone health?
Yeah, so because oxalate can bind to calcium, one of the things that it can do, besides getting deposited into all sorts of tissues and things, it can actually deplete our calcium as well as our other minerals. When it binds to those minerals, it renders them unavailable. So, for example, oxalate we call it an anti-nutrient because it actually binds to our minerals and then they can't get out of the gut into the bloodstream. So there's some really interesting studies out there that we can talk about oxalate as an anti-nutrient, but that's one of the ways it can cause some major problems for people with, working on their bone health, is that it can cause pretty significant depletions in calcium levels. And so it can really, some of the studies on rats really showed that it wasn't only bone quantity, but bone quality. So the oxalate not only caused a similar challenge that you would see in someone that was calcium deficient, but even more significantly, it was affecting the quality of the bone. I think because it was also affecting other minerals that the bones need as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, people, they're getting all this calcium and they're thinking they're doing so many great things, but yet it could be negatively affecting them. But you taught me something a while ago that I thought was really interesting because I had always told people that, okay, if you have a food that's high oxalates, you cannot count that food when you're calculating your calcium. However, you taught me that there was a study that actually showed that it wasn't just that food. You could actually affect other food, and other calcium in your meal. Do you want to just share that?
Absolutely. So one of the studies on rats they took their chow and they made it 50% deficient in calcium. And they gave half of them that chow. The other half, they added spinach enough to meet 100% of their calcium needs. But half of them was from half of that second half was the source was the spinach. And it turns out that the ones that had 100% of their calcium, but the extra was from spinach, had significantly lower bone quantity and bone quality. And one of the concerns from the researchers was that it was pulling potentially the other calcium that was in that food and binding to that and affecting its availability as well because of that really high oxalate level. So that's why I think it's a great thought that you don't want to assume you're going to be able to get that calcium from those high oxalate foods. But yeah, there is concern that if it's a high enough high enough oxalate food, it might not only be binding to that oxalate, it has the potential of binding to other calcium and other minerals.
Now let's talk about the gut, because the oxalates can really affect the gut, which we all know has a major impact on our bones. So what actually happens with the oxalates and the gut?
Yeah, so I think this is an important one because there are some great studies that I'm sure you've talked about a lot, which is the health of the gut, particularly the microbiome and osteoporosis, which is, I think, very interesting. We don't really think that the bacteria in our gut is going to have a direct influence on something so hard and dense and so deep in the body as our bones, but there is a correlation there. And so the health of our gut and particularly our microbiome are very important. Now, the gut and the microbiome go together so closely that I kind of think of them both in this conversation, because if the health of the gut isn't good, that it can affect our microbiome. And if our microbiome isn't good, that can affect the health of the gut. So when I think about it, I think of both of those things. And there are a lot of areas where oxalate can affect our gut. And so let me go into a couple of those. So if you think about a couple things, oxalates can directly harm our microbiome. And so sometimes people say, oh, well, our good bacteria can break down oxalate. Well, that's true. And so some people will say, well, then just take probiotics and then you won't have an oxalate issue. Well, unfortunately, that isn't true because oxalate can kill bacteria and harm our microbiome. It's not just as easy as adding more bacteria to it. We have to actually be careful and maybe reduce those levels of oxalate so that the oxalate isn't harming the microbiome itself. So those are a couple of the relationships with it. Also, if our gut isn't in good shape, we can have extra fat floating around if we're not able to break down our fat and absorb our fat. And then what happens is the fat binds to the calcium, and then that calcium isn't available to bind to the oxalate. So it's a bit of a two-way street. We talked earlier about how there's a challenge where if the oxalate binds to the calcium, it renders the calcium unavailable and then gets washed out in the stool. But the opposite is true too. If the calcium's not available to bind the oxalate, then that oxalate, normally that oxalate would be washed out in the stool because it would be bound to that calcium it can't get through. But in the case of a leaky gut, and in the case where that oxalate is free, that oxalate can then absorb through the gut, and now it can get into circulation. Now it can start depositing in places or causing havoc in the cells and things like that. So that's just another way that our gut, if it's not in good shape, can have this effect on this our oxalate levels. And yeah, so that's one thing. And then we can kind of slowly ease our way into it because you might have other questions for me. But that's where I think other diets can also be important to consider, because other diets, it depends what's affecting the gut for that individual. And with someone with oxalate issues, it might be oxalate, but it might be other compounds, and other therapeutic diets might be beneficial, maybe in combination or as their primary one. It all kind of depends a little bit on the individual.
So let's talk about symptoms, because you've seen so many people that have oxalate issues. And the truth is, if you look it up, every possible symptom can be from oxalates. It just goes on and on and on about what can be. But what have you seen are the most common?
Pain is one of the most common. Now, obviously, pain can be due to so many different things. So we can't always assume pain is not always caused by oxalate, but one of the big symptoms of oxalate is pain. And we see that with kidney stones. But we can also see that with sometimes somebody with a tennis elbow or something, or Somebody who's had challenge with their feet, or maybe even a hip. Sometimes oxalate will settle in those those places that might have previous injury or inflammation, and they can have this kind of chronic inflammatory and pain response. So that's probably one of the more common ones. Also because it can get into the mitochondria and affect the mitochondria. Fatigue is another one. But again, any one of these symptoms on its own could be so many different things. So I don't want people to think, oh, I have fatigue, that means it's oxalate, or I have pain, that means it is oxalate. But one of the things I teach practitioners is what I call the symptom clusters. What are maybe 3 or 4 or 5 things that might help indicate that oxalate is the direction rather than some other factor that's into play. But I'd say that those are 2 of the really big ones. Oxidative stress, which usually comes across in the case of in the form of pain, but it could affect the metabolic state as well. Those are a couple of the big ones. There are a lot of others depending on the person, whether it's affecting their gut, or sometimes it can even affect, once you start affecting the mitochondria, you can affect any system. So if you think about that, one person's symptoms might be a lot different than another person's, kind of depending where their area of weakness is, and how it shows up for them. Because if you think that, okay, and it can affect any organ system, and it can affect our metabolic state, it can really cause challenges in many different areas. And that's why it's a little bit tricky to kind of say what the overarching set of symptoms are. But those are 2 pretty big ones that I see a lot with my clients.
It's so interesting. Since this conversation has come up with all the people I work with, so many things have happened, but pain is a big one. And the problem is a lot of people just attribute it, oh, I have arthritis in my hip. Arthritis at a certain age becomes, oh yeah, it's just arthritis. It's just arthritis. But then we're going to talk about what people do, but then they reduce the oxalates. And I just can't even tell you what I've been hearing from other doctors, what I've been hearing just from people in general. I mean, one person, neck pain completely went away. Another person, vulvodynia, so a lot of different things, interstitial cystitis, certain things. It's just incredible. That's why this is such an important topic, because a lot of times people just attribute it to something else, and yet it's the oxalates, and they've never taken the time to deal with it and realize there's something else going on. And meanwhile, they're eating very high oxalate food, which we're going to go into in a minute.
Yes.
So,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So let's
That is true.
should we do that next? Like what? Because I also want to go into how we test for this, but why don't we go into, either way, would you rather go into the food first, or would you rather go into testing?
Let's do food, because
Yeah,
I think people always wonder, well, what are we talking about?
exactly.
So there are a lot of greens, but not all greens, and we'll talk about that and have some resources for people and things. But so spinach is a really big one. Swiss chard, beet greens. There's a lot of greens that can be a challenge, but also almonds. If you think beets themselves, sweet potatoes. If we think about also, unfortunately, things that are rich in calcium often are high in oxalate because it binds to that calcium. So that's one that becomes a little tricky. So people will think, oh, for my bone health, I need to get some good calcium-rich foods. So that's where it can be tricky. That's why even things like almonds, which can be a good source of calcium, that can get a little challenging for people. Let's see, chocolate, even things like sweet potatoes, buckwheat, amaranth, so some of the gluten-free foods. Again, it doesn't mean they're all bad or not to do a gluten-free diet. It's just that we want to just be aware of oxalate and then not choose foods that are too high. So an example is that, the average person might get like 100 milligrams or something, and maybe for a low oxalate diet, we need, a lot less than that, or less than that, let's say. 1/4 cup of almond flour has 450 milligrams of oxalate in a serving. Spinach, 1 serving, has 500 milligrams of oxalate in the serving. So you can see it adds, for some of those extremely high foods, it adds up very quickly. But for practitioners, or people that are listening that might be looking for lists online, it can get kind of confusing because, well, firstly, there some of the testing, I don't know if it's just because it's older testing, but sometimes you'll see conflicting information on, let's say, berries, and some people say all berries. It's not necessarily all berries, it's certain berries. So just those kinds of things can help someone have a little bit more of a robust diet. They can find themselves a really good, accurate list that will really help them, be able to not be so restrictive. Also looking at just a variety of other types of foods, we can see like something that might be considered high, they might consider 15 or 20 milligrams high, whereas the two I said are extremely high. And so one food, like they might call carrots high, technically they would be considered high, but they're right on the borderline of, let's say, 15. Whereas something else like another type of nut might be 50, which is a lot higher, whereas almond flour is almost 500. So you can see there is a radical difference. Now, I do think most nuts are probably too high for most people that have an oxalate issue, but you can see for the average person, they can go overboard easily without realizing it because maybe they're doing keto. So they're like, oh, I want a dessert or a bread or something. I'm going to use almond flour. Well, very easily you can go overboard. I've had clients in the past that did like a grain-free diet, and they would have sometimes, 6 to 9 or more like nut muffins or nut bread foods a day. And, I've had clients come to me doing 1,000 milligrams of oxalate, 2,000 milligrams before they came to see me because they just didn't know, or juicing spinach or a spinach salad every day. So things like that. So I think an awareness of what foods are high and what foods are extremely high can really help someone just have a little bit more of a realistic diet that can still be well-rounded, rich in nutrients, rich in calcium, but avoid things that might be a problem for them.
And do you have numbers that you tell people, in terms of, how many, or someone who has an issue?
Yeah. So it's going to be typically less than 100. There are some numbers for people, but because everybody is so different, some people might need less, some people might need more. So I've always seen it's less than 100. It might be, some people might be 40, 50, 60, so I don't want to they probably benefit from seeing a practitioner to really dial in what level is going to be best for them. But just to give someone a sense, it's going to be less than the average person. But also they want to be careful not to do it too quickly because they don't want to start what we call dumping oxalate when they've had a diet very high, which is why I suggest if you're a practitioner to really study how to lower it carefully, ways to do that. And if you're an individual, find a good practitioner that really understands these factors that can really help you figure out, are there supplements that would be beneficial? Are there, how to reduce it slowly over time? Because I think that's really important. And there's some great practitioners out there doing this.
I think that's such a good point because people are listening. Okay, I'll just get rid of the almonds. I'll get rid of this. I'll get rid of that. And you can get really sick. And you want to explain what that dumping is so people understand, like, definitely do not do this quickly?
Yes, you definitely don't want to do it quickly because it can just start, the body thinks, whoo, well, I don't know what the body's thinking, but my assumption is it's kind of like, okay, we got rid of all of that stuff coming in, so let's get rid of some. That's what I think is probably going on. And it can create a lot of pain, kind of flu-like symptoms, just not feeling well. But it can be very different for different people. And for some people, it can have pretty significant ramifications health-wise. And so it's just, I think like many of us, like one time I had mercury, and it's like, get the mercury out, but you want to do all of these things carefully and safely. You don't want to just go, doing them. And I feel like the same thing with something like oxalate. You just talk to somebody. It's probably been a long time you've been doing that. So, talking to someone can help, and figuring out a game plan of the best way to go about it is usually a good way.
And if someone decides, oh, I'm just going to start gradually, if they do it very slowly, should that be pretty safe if they do this, cutting it out slowly?
Usually, but again, slowly is going to depend a little bit on how high it was to begin with.
Mm.
So, just being careful and just, making sure that, you're working with someone or you feel comfortable with what you're doing. I just like to, uh, I just like to be cautious and careful when I'm talking to a general audience so that people, are getting any support they might need. But, rather than going quickly, going slowly. But again, all depends where somebody's starting out with. And also another thing, it can store in the body. So sometimes even after you take it out, the body can still do some dumping. And some people that have, depending on what your oxalate issue is from, there's different causes of oxalate. Is it from a leaky gut and a diet really high? Or is it from some biochemical condition in the body where the body creates extra oxalate from certain supplements or from certain deficiencies or from certain foods, which, we probably can't touch on all of them today, but just be aware that what this is called endogenous oxalate. And so for some people, they might say, well, I've never really had a diet that high in oxalate, but your body can produce oxalate. And so that's just another thing to just be aware of. So whether you are or aren't having a diet high in oxalate, there's another potential component. And for people that have that endogenous, that can actually be a huge source of their oxalate issue. I've seen some studies where for some people, a vast majority of their oxalate wasn't coming from the diet, but was coming from this, internal endogenous production. So again, that's why I think it's beneficial to work with someone that can kind of help you maybe figure out a game plan for some, ways to go. Because if it's not just diet for you, it might be something else. Or if it's been a while, it might have some dumping that happens after. And sometimes people feel a little worse before they feel better. So I want to make sure that they're working with someone so that they can figure out, what might be going on. And is it from that or is it from something else? I always hesitate to say, oh, it's just from that thing. Just keep going when maybe it's something else and maybe their doctor would identify something totally unrelated to this. So I like them to, like I said, just make sure they're working with people that can really support them.
I mean, there's a couple conditions. Certain gut bacteria can have a major. You want to just share about that? People who don't have certain gut bacteria?
Yeah, so that's another potential source of, or not source, but reason some people might have a high oxalate. There are a number of bacteria actually that break down oxalate. One was actually discovered for this reason. That's Oxalobacter formigenes. And that one, we discovered that one of the primary things it does is break down oxalate. So if you don't have good bacteria levels of that it's a potential opportunity for the body to have higher oxalate level because it might not be able to break it down. The body might not be able to break it down, or the microbiome might not be able to break it down. Now, there are other bacteria that do break down oxalate. It's not the only one. It's just a primary one or a good one for that. And it can be damaged fairly easily with other things. So, I guess just the microbiome is an important component. And there are things that people can do just to support their health, support their microbiome, support the growth of all sorts of good bacteria that can be helpful.
And any genetics play a role in this?
Well, there are some genetics. There are some primary conditions. There's primary hyperoxaluria, type 1 and type 2, and those can be due to genetic conditions. There are some people also with probably certain genes that might be involved in certain more common deficiencies or more common endogenous production pathways and things like that. So there are some genetics involved for some people.
So what do you do about testing? Do you have any ways that you suggest people test if they're wondering if this is, or what's your suggestion?
There are some things that people can do. Sometimes people will go to more of a functional doctor and do something like an oxalic acid test, like a urine test, and they can do that. Sometimes certain labs have organic acid tests, and some of them have an oxalic acid marker. There are also other markers that more kind of traditional doctors might do. There's ways you can look at oxalate under a microscope. There's that's in the urine. There are 24-hour urine and different things. So different doctors might help someone figure out what might be going on for that individual.
Okay, so I think the most important question is, okay, so we're listening to this and we do have oxalates in our diets. And it isn't, this, the thing is, as you said, which I love about the work you do with being so bio-individual, is that it's different for every person, where it's not an issue for everybody. But for some people, it can be life-changing. And that's what I've seen in the community, that when people, and that's why I wanted to have you here on the podcast, because we can't ignore this. And people want to, oh, no big deal. I eat that food, no problem. But there are people who it's a huge problem. And when they figure this out, life changes dramatically.
Yes.
But what can people do? Like, what can we do if we are consuming oxalates? What are some steps people can take to reduce the load? I mean, you
Well,
mentioned eat less, but what else?
yeah, good question. So are these just general people that want to eat less oxalate, or are these people that have been told by their practitioner or suspect they might have an oxalate issue?
Yeah, let's. I guess we could do both, because there are steps everybody can take.
Right.
Correct? Yeah, let's
Right.
do both. But either way, you can start. The person who, I would like to know both people, just people who
Okay.
may want to reduce it and people who really need to reduce it.
Right. So people that just and now have an awareness of, wow, I didn't realize that spinach salad I was eating every single day was so high in oxalate or whatever it is. I would say, number one, just have an awareness of what some of the extremely high oxalate foods are. And then just consider over time, maybe trading some of them out or eating them less often. So unfortunately, a lot of the quote, healthy foods that we think of, not a lot, but some of these sort of health foods that we think of, like chia seeds, and people have the chia pudding, or like I said, the almond flour, or we talked about spinach a lot. But there are some of these foods that are, people think, wow, I'm whatever, I'm vegetarian, or I eat so healthy, just not aware of how high in oxalate their diet can become. So I think number one is just an awareness of what these foods are. Another awareness might be, what are some of the common symptoms? And, do they have those? For practitioners, there's a much larger list of potential symptoms. So that way, if you're a practitioner, that's good to know, because you want to have a bigger picture when you're working with somebody. So that's part one, an awareness that certain foods are extremely higher. Certain foods are extremely higher than other foods, and a list of what those foods are. And then for me, for example, with spinach, if I'm going to a fancy restaurant, maybe I love Eggs Benedict's one of my favorites. So if there's spinach, I don't know, maybe I'll choose the one without spinach. Or maybe if it's a really great dish, I can't think of one right now, but that, a really nice restaurant, I'll do the spinach, but maybe it's twice a year rather than every day, or whatever it is for that individual. I just tend not to do it very often, because I tend to find out like other things instead. But, my daughter just brought a smoothie back and it had some spinach in it. I'll probably eat it for myself because I don't have an oxalate issue. So I'm just trying to be a little bit more moderation, just more awareness on those foods. Eating them less frequently or lower amounts, I think, can go a long way, because there are other good nutrients in some of these things, like, folate, Swiss chard and folate, or something else, or beets and like betaine and things like that. So, it doesn't, I guess for me, it's like, it's not that I never eat these foods. It's just when you have an awareness, you can make more choices of moderation and decide which ones you really want, because they might have some other nutrients you're really trying to get in at that time. So I would say for the average person, that would be my thinking. Also switching one thing to another, like, as I mentioned, almond flour has about 10 times the oxalate as other nuts do. So taking maybe, almonds and cashews and peanuts are pretty high, are quite high. Almonds the highest, whereas something like a walnut or hazelnut, they might have, more in the 50 range, right? So again, maybe I will do a nut flour with a different nut. If I don't have a big issue, that doesn't really work if you have high oxalate because those nuts are still too high. If you have high oxalate concerns and you're needing to lower them, there are other seeds that people might look at instead of the nuts. So, looking at something like pumpkin seeds or something else, and then deciding how they might want to use them. Can you still make a bread out of them? Do you want to? Do you just aware of this? And now you're like, no, I'm going to go to cauliflower instead for my, with a pizza crust or something, right? So those are a couple things for people that need to lower oxalate, that have high oxalate. I'll give you a couple of the greens, but then share that resource that I shared with you today.
Why don't you tell them what it is? Tell them, yeah,
Okay,
this is great. Julie has created something fabulous for everybody.
Thank you. I put together a handout of the high calcium, low oxalate foods, some of my top favorites, so that people that are greens. So my top high calcium, low oxalate greens, because people will often say, oh, don't do that diet. It's incredibly unhealthy because there's no good greens. So there are greens. Certain forms of kale are better than others. There are things like turnip greens that are good. Even things like broccoli are still green. So this handout will give you more information on that and give you a list of some of my favorite greens that are higher in calcium but lower in oxalate. So for people that are needing to lower that oxalate, there are grains that are lower. There are vegetables that are lower. There are all sorts of, there are seeds. Well, there are seeds that are lower. So there's always some things that you can do. It's just a matter of finding them. And also another important thing, if you're going to go down this route, is being aware of portion size. So let's say carrots. Again, I'll take carrots. I don't remember the serving size. I want to say maybe it's like a half a cup. A half a cup of carrots is considered, like I said, like 15 or 20 milligrams. So that's considered high. And it probably is too high if you're on a low oxalate diet. Why would you want to use all your oxalate in that one place? But if you don't know, let's say you're at a restaurant and there's like 4 little shavings of carrot on your salad. The portion size is also important. So you still might not decide you don't want to do that, but just be aware, because something like, let's say chia seeds, a tablespoon versus a half a cup, or, some of them that are really high, you're not really going to be able to lower them probably to any good extent. So chia seeds and some of those seeds might be out, whereas other seeds are low and others are medium. So I guess my point is portion size is also a factor. So when you're looking at them, don't only look at the list of foods, but what portion size equals that, because you might find that the amount that's in something is so low, it doesn't really make it high. Whereas something else might be a medium, but if you just had 4 servings of it, then that can make it high. So all of those kinds of things I think are valuable to consider.
And then what about boiling versus steaming in terms of the way we cook things?
Yes. So there's different types of oxalate, but I won't go into too much of the detail here. But practitioners should know that there's soluble oxalate, insoluble oxalate, and different ways that you can cook things that for some foods can lower the oxalate based on the type of oxalate that's in there. But just generally speaking, for the average person, steaming doesn't reduce oxalate to any significant degree. So you'll hear a myth out there that cooking your vegetables, cooking your oxalates is going to reduce the oxalate load in them. And that's actually not correct as a general rule. So sauteing something or is really not going to lower the oxalate. Steaming something, not very much. Whereas boiling does, because boiling them, if you boil it and then like say a soup and you drink the water of it, that won't lower the oxalate because it ends up in the water. But if you boil something and then you drain it off, that does lower the oxalate content. Now, it only lowers it on average about 50%. So if you have something like spinach, it's not going to make spinach a low oxalate food, but it can take something that's a medium or a slightly borderline high, and it can really bring it down into a range that gives somebody a lot more a variety in their diet.
Oh, this is just so helpful. And it is so important because, people are suffering because they just don't know about this. And
Yes.
so how long do you see when people work with a practitioner and they're reducing their oxalates? How long do you typically see till they'll notice, wow, my neck doesn't hurt anymore? And
Mhm. It depends on the person. So some people, it's more quick than others. It kind of depends what was behind it, and, how long it's been going on and all of that. If that is the issue and that's the primary issue, sometimes it can take a while. It can take a number of months. Sometimes it can take a number of months just to reduce the oxalate, depending on who the person is. And then sometimes it can take some time to really um, see that benefit. Other people, they see responses a little bit more quickly. And actually, as somebody does a diet for a while, they'll notice right away. They'll notice. One of my colleagues and good friends came to me one day and said, "Oh no, I just had kiwi for the first time in a long time and my pain came back. Are kiwis high oxalate?" Yes, yes, they are. So, but then they were able to just take that out because everything else was low, and then things got better. So again, it kind of depends, how long somebody has been needing to, or how long they've been addressing it and what's kind of underlying it. But usually it's a longer term thing, takes some time. Some people need to do it for more long term. Again, it depends what was behind it for them. Is it something that's more just kind of a little bit of their biochemistry and a little bit more who they are, a little, not who they are, but a little bit more just an ongoing thing? Or is it something that maybe was like caused by the perfect storm of challenges, and those challenges over time get resolved? There can be some difference in someone's ability to handle it going forward.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, the pain though, of the people I have seen who've really gotten better, oh my gosh, they had severe pain, like
Yes.
sharp pain.
Yes.
It can be really pretty uncomfortable.
Yes, yes. And you often don't think about it, even like you said, vulvar pain. So the Vulvar Pain Foundation, they discovered this, I don't know, I think a few decades ago or something. But I don't even know how well known it is, even in the mainstream at this point, even though it's something that they've been talking about for a very long time. And, I was looking at research on it, and there's some research on some of these things for sure, but other things there isn't as much as you'd expect after all of these years of, people like these foundations and things knowing about it. But yeah, and it can be quite, like you said, it can be quite significant, the pain that they have. And if it's something that they can address through their foods, that's great. So,
Yeah, and what a sad reason to lose bone, because especially when you're trying to have high calcium foods. So that's why it's just so frustrating. But as we said, there's a lot that can be done. So
absolutely.
you have a couple things for us. You have that handout that will be in the show notes. We'll have the link for that. Also tell people, because there's a lot of practitioners who listen to the podcast. So why don't you just share what you offer to practitioners as well?
Yeah, so I have a practitioner's guide to food intolerances, therapeutic diets, and bioindividual nutrition. So I practice a type of personalized nutrition that I call bioindividual nutrition. So it's biochemical individuality, and how therapeutic diets and nutrition are applied on that individual level. And so this guide is about all sorts of different food compounds. So when we talked about the health of the gut earlier, we didn't really have capacity to talk too much about other food compounds, but there are things like grains that some of them, grains can be pretty problematic for the gut, and grain-free diets can be helpful. But in other ways, some of those grain-free alternatives, like the almond flour, can be a negative for other people. So looking at those things, looking at things like FODMAPs and how they can affect it. So looking at dozens of different diets and these food intolerances, why people have the food intolerances, what kind of factors underlie why somebody might have a food intolerance to this while someone else doesn't. Like we talked about oxalates in great detail today. So I go through about 10 other different types of food compounds and who might have an issue, what symptoms they can cause, why, what people can do, the different therapeutic diets. Again, I go through about 10 of those, different diets, why they're used, when they're used, how they're used, some foods that are high, some foods that are low. It's about a 45-page guide for practitioners. And so they can just get that very easily by going to that link. There's no charge for it or anything. It's just a guide that I wanted to share with practitioners because it's something I've been doing for over 20 years. And I feel that it's time. I mean, probably about, oh gosh, maybe 9 years ago, when I was doing a lot of work in this area, people didn't even know what oxalate was. So now I'm very excited that a lot more people know about these things. So I want to get these resources out to practitioners because now they're aware that these are areas that can really help them improve their practice. So, yeah.
Oh, I love that. And your other guide's fabulous too for everybody on the oxalates. So we have some two great things. You want to just share also for those who might be interested about your course?
Absolutely. So for practitioners that are interested, I have I've a main training program. It's called BioIndividual Nutrition Training. So they can find that at BioIndividual Nutrition. And that is for all practitioners that are using nutrition in their practice for a wide range of conditions for adults and children. I then have an additional course that makes up my pediatric program. So people that are specifically interested in autism and ADHD and even Down syndrome or anxiety for children and all of these types of conditions that would affect children and how they're different and how their nutrition is different and or their needs are different and how they handle diet can be different and applied specifically to the underlying biochemistry. That is also available. They can find out more about that on my website as well. But those are my two main training programs for practitioners.
And what I think is so wonderful, Julie, is that you learn this in detail, but then you break it down and really make it easy and give resources so people can then apply it and make a difference with their clients and their patients. And so, you're really doing a great service in the world. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. One of the main things that when I'm working with clients, it takes me probably on average 3 hours, or it had been, to put together a customized plan because like someone with low oxalate, maybe they are on a grain-free diet. Now they need a low oxalate grain-free diet. And maybe they're allergic to eggs or, intolerant to dairy. So each time I had to put these resources together took me an immense amount of time. It would take hours. And so for my practitioners, you're right. I have, 5-page food lists on not only the low oxalate diet, but a low oxalate diet that's also grain-free or a low oxalate diet that's also low in histamine or something like that. So yeah, that I figured why have everybody reinvent the wheel when I can make their life easier and save them hours per client. I was going to say hours a day, actually more than hours a day, to be able to really give people really good resources on how to do these things. So.
And if people want to find practitioners, do you have that resource as well as people who've taken your classes?
Yes. So if they go to bioindividualnutrition.com, individuals can also find practitioners that have gone through my training.
Oh, that's great. Well, this has been so helpful. And, the other thing is you make it that it's not scary. So people aren't, oh my gosh, the oxalates, it's doable, it's treatable, and it's just so important to be aware of it. I think that's the key. But is there any last minute thing you want to share before we end?
Oh boy. I mean, I guess I would say, my other organization that works with kids is called Nourishing Hope. And that's where I teach and share things with parents. So if there are any parents listening, but I wasn't actually going to even talk about that program. I was just going to say this concept of keep nourishing hope. There's always things you can do, practitioners you can go to, people that can help you, on all different sides, figure out how to support, where you are. So, and if you're a practitioner, you do so much for so many people. So thank you for helping all of them nourish hope as well. So I guess that's what I would say. And I would say the same to you. Thank you so much for having me on and helping so many people.
Oh, well, I love nourishing hope. I just love the whole thing because that's what we need. And, I always say dig deep and there is hope and so much that can be done. And so that we can all live, you know, the happiest, healthiest lives we possibly can. So thank you so much for all you do and for taking the time to join me here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Julie and now have a better understanding of oxalates and how they can be negatively affecting our bones and what we can do. All the links that Julie talked about, including the link to her oxalate sheet, as well as the practitioner resource, will be in the show notes. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.